Some of the hardest problems in the world exist far above the planet. Our job? To launch the smartest solutions, to protect our satellites, clean up our clutter, to propel breakthroughs in propulsion, to learn more about our place in the universe, to outpace emerging threats. Every day, the Aerospace Corporation uses the latest technologies to ensure our nation's safety and leadership in space.
Hi, and welcome to the Space Policy Show. We have a great episode for you today. We are talking about defending the space enterprise in the cyber domain. There's my co-host, Corbin Dallas. We've got Lori Gordon, Ryan Spielman, and John Felker to join us today. Before we get started, just a reminder, you can find us on Twitter at hashtag the Space Policy Show, and you can ask your questions on Vimeo under the video box. You can also find us at aerospace.org/policy. Lori Gordon is a technology strategist in national and homeland security, cybersecurity, infrastructure risk, and resilience at the Aerospace Corporation. She's an advisor to ISO, ANSI, and NIST technical working groups as a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute. She's also served on curriculum advisory boards in the areas of cybersecurity and infrastructure security, law and government, and resilient design. Ryan Spielman is the principal director for the cybersecurity subdivision at the Aerospace Corporation, where he's focused on security of space-based systems. The organization he leads is involved in many layers of space cybersecurity, from legacy system protection to requirements and program development to advanced research and development techniques. We also have John Felker, who is with DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. He's the assistant director leading the Integrated Operations Division. IOD focuses on integrated operations across the agency, extending to the 10 regional CISA elements and leading intelligence, operational planning, and mission execution, with emphasis on risk mitigation and response efforts. I'm going to turn it over to Lori to start off the conversation.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us today to discuss some really important issues related to our topic, defending the space enterprise in the cyber domain. It's great to be joined by a leader in our field, John Felker with DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and my colleague and the head of cyber at Aerospace, Ryan Spielman. So thank you both for being here today. Looking forward to discussion. So the first one, just want to lay the broad landscape here, sort of a general question, and we'll start with John. How does securing the spacecraft enterprise differ from securing traditional IT systems?
Well, I think they're relatively similar, but obviously there are limitations based upon the distance that the spacecraft is eventually going to be in the air, and the amount of room that you have on the spacecraft for hardware and things like that. But I think essentially the underlying security requirement is the same. And so I think as you are building out a space program, consideration for security has to be within the mix as you're thinking about what do I need to do to get the mission done. Security needs to be plugged into that all along the way.
Ryan,
yeah, I think.
Want to take that question?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think at a high level, the concepts and the principles are the same. Defense in depth, zero trust networks, things like that. But when you look at the ability to implement commercial technology, you can't just put commercial technology and cyber defense technology into the systems, because all the hardware we're talking about is different. All the software is different. It's been custom built. All the networks are different. The networks look nothing like a commercial IT system. So I think the key is to take the concepts, that we've kind of, grown to appreciate, and even some of the technology that's been built up for commercial IT systems, and figure out how to apply it to these systems, and make sure, for example, in a spacecraft enterprise, although the networks are custom, they're also a lot more predictable. There's a lot less, what looks like random activity. You don't have people surfing the web or checking their email and things like that. So we can take advantage of the fact that the network activity should be a lot more predictable.
Great. So Ryan, kind of pulling that thread a little bit, we see the commercialization of space, and how do we secure? There's a lot of different types of satellites going up now, including small sats, and those prototype missions. How do they play into security, and do they need the same level of security as other more traditional systems? Ryan, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think the way that we're going to run the risk analysis and the risk framework is going to be the same. I think that those systems will have less cyber defenses on them because they'll want to save costs in some area, and a lot of threats won't apply to them. But I think the mapping from threat to mitigation to requirement and the way that we pick and choose which requirements make sense for various missions, I think all of that logic and all that analysis is the same. I just think you're going to end up with a different requirement base based on what the system is and what it's supposed to do and what threats are really applicable to it.
I think you make a really good point. You start talking about the engineering of that system from the beginning, with both the people who are trying to solve the problems to get the mission done and the security group who's plugged into that mix, so that you're making those trade-offs and knowing full well what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. And like you said, I think, Ryan, you're absolutely right. The spread of threat against a spacecraft is going to be much different than it is against you and me sitting at our home computer, and it's probably a more finite group of threats that are in play there as well.
So moving on to the next question. So in terms of penetration testing, I know, John, you're very familiar with this, with CISA, Homeland Security, doing this on the .gov network. But how do we run penetration tests on a spacecraft? Is that similar? Should it include ground and space or just ground? What does that look like?
Yeah, without knowing or being an expert in space by any means, but I would tell you from a security perspective, the way I would look at it is this: that yes, we should be doing penetration testing on ground stations from the start of the development of the system. We should figure out how to do pen testing in the spacecraft when it's in the air, given due consideration for the differences that exist. And the criticality of some routines that are executed by the spacecraft that you might not want to mess with. We've been thinking through how to do pen testing on industrial control systems for the last 4 or 5 years in CISA and in the NCAG. And we're very, very careful about that because the tolerances are so narrow and so forth that you can't afford to break something while you're doing a pen test on a control system. And I suspect the same applies in the spacecraft, because if you think about it, you've shot something up into space. You just can't send a repairman to go fix it. So you got to be really careful about what you do. I do think you can do both, however.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think we have a lot to learn from how these things are done in the ICS world. I think the very simple answer to the question is very carefully. But I do think it's important to do these things. I think we absolutely should be doing these things. I think we can. It's not going to be like a 3-person pen test that comes in for a week and writes a report and gets out of there. It's going to be there's going to be a lot more system engineering. All their actions should be scripted, and we should understand what the possible consequences are. If you're talking about an in-flight system, the ability for the system to recover needs to be understood. But I think the most important thing is, if we have the policy and the requirements to build these systems to begin with, such that they will be pen tested, that's the expectation from the contractor when they start building the systems, and that's the expectation of the system engineers who are designing these things, then I think the systems will be built to be even more recoverable, which has a bunch of benefits, besides just cybersecurity. So I think there's just a lot of really good reasons to do it, but I think also there's a lot of really good reasons to do it up front, to say we are going to do this up front.
Yep, absolutely agree.
So it's sort of a similar question, but maybe there are some differences. How do spacecraft operators play into cyber defense? You've named some things, some specifics, but any
I
drill
think
down a
they're
little bit
I think
more?
they're no different than industrial control system operators. Ryan made a really good point. You have to understand what the routines are. You have to understand what the mitigation steps are up front. And if something happens, you need to follow the script as best you can to get to a point where you're mitigating that risk.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, whether they like it or not, the spacecraft operators are your frontline cyber defenders. And they need to be treated that way. They need to be told that is their job going in. I think a lot of the pen tests really should be red team tests, and you get a lot of benefit from doing that. Besides just checking to see if the spacecraft recovers the right way, you get a lot of these secondary benefits, like being able to build up courses of action, being able to train your spacecraft operators to look for an anomaly and be able to rapidly classify that anomaly as a random failure or an actual cyber intrusion, in which case they have much different courses of action they need to take and much different speeds at which they need to be taken.
So how does all of this play into sort of a broader, like a defense in depth program, cybersecurity scheme for space? Is this just what we're talking about, just one part of it, or are there other layers that you might, add into your defense in depth cyber profile approach?
Yeah, I think there are layers. Just like this goes back to kind of the question about how this differs from IT systems. It doesn't at the high level concept like we're talking about. You have to have onboard mitigation techniques. You have to have network monitoring and command monitoring on the ground to understand what you're sending, why you're sending it. You need to do traffic analysis to make sure that if there is even if you're talking about a cyber intrusion at the reconnaissance phase, you should be able to detect the stuff because we need to take advantage of the fact that our network traffic is so much more predictable than they are in more like IT systems. And I think we can learn a lot from the way things are done in the ICS world.
Good. So moving on to sort of the difference between legacy systems, sort of what we've seen there, over the years, and how we're approaching security for those. But how about does that differ from when we're thinking about more modern solutions? Since we're seeing newer threats, and how do those old legacy systems? How are we sort of reconciling the newer emerging threats that we're seeing every day? Is there a difference in approach from legacy to newer systems?
I think the overall approach is very similar. I think the things that come into play are obviously, what software language did this program was written in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the spacecraft that's up there now probably has COBOL and Fortran language, and there's very few people who can still write, read, and understand that, let alone figure out a way to break into it and do it in a spacecraft that's orbiting around the Earth.
It might be more robust.
Yeah. So I think that's one consideration. And just like anything else, we as things get more complex, as there are more and more lines of code in a particular application to do the things that we needed to do, then we've introduced greater attack surface. And so I think that has to be a consideration as well. So by definition, you kind of look at it a little bit differently, although it's the same. It's just a question of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I don't think we should take the approach that just because a system was built before kind of modern cyber threats were envisioned and seen, that we can't do anything. I think that's absolutely the wrong approach. There's a bunch of things we can do. We mentioned earlier that we have a couple advantages. One is a space control network, for example, has a lot less computers. They have a lot more predictable traffic, and so just doing simple things like traffic monitoring with rules-based and AI-based techniques can go a long way to detecting an attack when it's at the very, very early stages. We need to be taking advantage of that. We absolutely need to understand what traffic is traversing our networks and why, and have we ever seen something like this before? Is it different? And then rapidly classify, is this an anomaly? Is this a once in a while event like a spacecraft maneuver, or is this a cyber intrusion? And I think those things are fairly easy to classify.
Yeah, I agree.
Ryan, just pulling the thread on the AI piece, how are we using AI to aid in securing these systems? Like, is there some examples, or just sort of a
absolutely.
broad?
Yeah, there's a lot of research going on in that field, and AI it doesn't solve all the world's problems. Maybe it will one day, I don't know, but I think it's really, really good at detecting things that are different from what it's seen in the past. And if you have a system, and we generally do, that have very predictable network traffic, AI is a fantastic tool to use to flag things, say, hey, this is different. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We could be doing a maintenance maneuver. We could be doing some sort of spacecraft maneuver. So you're not necessarily saying I'm going to take an action and shut the entire system down. You're just saying, hey, this is different than I've ever seen. Are you sure this is what you want to be doing? And I think there's a lot of things that we are and can be doing there.
Good. So, John, in addition to technology, what are some other levers of change that we should focus on? Standards, policies, incentives. What do you see, just sort of writ large, in terms, cybersecurity and what you're working on at CISA?
Well, I think one of our biggest challenges is workforce. How do we get the workforce that we need to be able to do the things that we want to do in the cyber environment? There are a number of different people that have talked about the workforce shortage across the nation in cybersecurity. So I think we need to be thinking about the workforce differently than we have been thinking about it. Mm-hmm. There's one school of thought that says we need to develop cyber workforce, and they need to go through have good solid STEM K through 12 education. They need to go to a college or university and get a degree in computer science or some other discipline related to computers. And then we can begin to put them to work, gaining experience and getting better at doing the things we need them to do. But there's a whole different school of thought that says, yeah, that's good, but there might be some other ways, non-traditional ways to get workforce. And we've had some good success recruiting in community colleges, 2-year schools that have a focus on hands-on cyber skills, and you get people in the workforce much more quickly. Certainly that needs the basic developments of the STEM education that we've been talking about, but you can go directly from community college, or in some cases no college at all, but a military background where you've had training in computer techniques and so forth. And we can put them to work right away. The other part of the debate is certifications. Are certifications useful? Certainly. But are they the be-all and end-all? Just like is a bachelor's degree in computer science is the be-all and end-all? No, I think we need to look at different ways to bring people with the aptitude into the equation and start them on a career path if that's what they choose. I'll raise an example. The SANS Institute did a study a couple of years ago out in the Middle East where they trialed some boot camp methodology and so forth, and it was fairly successful. And so they brought it back to the UK and they put it in place in the UK because UK had at the time had a pretty significant unemployment issue. And the process revolved around an aptitude test. And then from that aptitude test, which involved both the traditional learning, answering questions, and also involved a little bit of hands-on keyboard, but not much. They determined that certain people had better aptitude and not. The fellow who scored the highest in the aptitude and went on to succeed in the boot camp process and got a job, started as a bartender with zero cyber experience. So it doesn't have to be the traditional way. We need to look at more and broader ways to bring folks into the workforce that are interested in doing it. And we're starting to see some of that too.
Ryan, how do you see it for the Space Force?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to kind of fall into what John said. we can say, okay, here's the right education we want for every one of our spacecraft cyber operators. But that's going to take a really long time. I think the easier thing to do is to say, we have all these people that know how to operate a spacecraft. They know what to look for. They know what's different, and they know what an anomaly is. They can be trained on courses of action. They can be trained on what traffic should be flowing over the network. They can be trained on what are these tools telling you, and how to take appropriate action for that. And I think that's a much more practical, much more rapid way to get us where we need to be with personnel.
And here's the last thing along those lines. I think we absolutely have to not get locked into either in a job requisition or a position announcement. You must have these things. We've got to find a way to better test people who apply. We hire people all the time at CISA for cyber roles. And we get a stack of resumes that have been qualified by OPM and the human capital organizations. And generally, they meet the mail based upon the job advertisement. But if I have a stack of 1,000 resumes to go through and I'm hiring for 4 positions, that's a significant load on the hiring manager and the group of people who, by definition, are a part of the equation when it comes to actually delivering mission. So how do we get that? How do we get that number down to manageable levels? Oh, and by the way, manageable levels in which the people who will remain have demonstrated some skills. So what we've started doing in CISA is we've had a pilot for the last year or so to actually give people a test. So if you make that list of 1,000 on your resume, that's good. We send you a link, and the link says, "Take this test. Prove it to me. Prove to me what your resume says." And they go through the test, and then it's scored automatically. They know their score right away. It's very objective. And then we work the number down, and there's a 2 or 3 step process that we can go through where you actually prove some of the skills that you have, and that's regardless of what your college education is, or what your degree says, or what your certificates say. It shows that you can actually do the work, and I think we need to get more balance in doing actually the work and certificates and degrees and so forth. And it's got to be balanced.
Mm-hmm. From your perspectives on NIST, or the cybersecurity framework, the risk management framework, do you think that translates across all sectors? Do you think it's enough for space, or are there some gaps there that we need to pull the thread on, or put sort of a light on to say, we need to dig down and develop some additional standards around this particular area in space?
I think they apply. The NIST standards are great. The 20 critical controls are great. But when you get into a very specialized environment, and Ryan can talk to this much better than I can, when you get into this specialized environment of space, there by definition there's going to be some trade-offs and some things that you're going to want to do and some things you're not going to want to do. That'd be my suspicion. Ryan, you could probably address that better than I.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's kind of like everything else. The concept, how you manage risk, the risk management framework, all that stuff applies. But I don't think we can kind of blindly slap some controls on a space mission. There's a lot of other things going on. For example, spacecraft have very complicated fault management systems that have been built up over the years, and they've been tested, and they've had actual faults, and they have recovered and most of the time correctly from those faults. When you apply cybersecurity to a spacecraft, you can't just throw that out the window. You need to figure out how to combine that, because you are operating in a harsh environment that will have random failures, and the space systems need to recover appropriately from them, because like John mentioned, you can't just send a repairman up there to fix it. And so a properly designed cyber system for a spacecraft takes into account, all the heritage fault management system development.
And that's similar, I think, to you could use a really easily understandable example is the electric grid. we can send a repairman out, but the electric industry's got really good at not doing that because they've built up over a period of time those policies and procedures to address the fault and address the fault remotely. So it's not new thinking really. It's just you have to think a little bit differently based upon, in my view anyway, based upon the scope of the mission.
Yeah, and it's interesting in terms of different sectors. Space is sort of one of those sectors that we work so much with the international community, whether it's Japanese Space Agency, ESA and others. It's almost like how do we better define what those international standards are as well. So, well, thank you both. It was a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate the time, and thanks to everyone who is listening. So, thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Lori, Ryan, and John. We are so happy to have you on our show today. It was such an interesting episode talking about defending the space enterprise in the cyber domain. As always, find us on Twitter, #the Space Policy Show. Go to aerospace.org/policy or ask your questions in the video comments below. And until next time, take care.